Én Stírkata vagyok, ez pedig a Bitcoin Kebab, a Bitcoin bázis podcastja.
Hi, Alex, and thank you so much for accepting the invitation. I'm glad that we made it. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Okay, great. So today we are here to have a discussion about your recently published book titled Hidden Repression, How the IMF and the World Bank Sell Exploitation as Development. So since I was born in 1980 and grew up in the 1990s in a post-communist country, namely Hungary, the names of the IMF and the World Bank resonate familiarly with me. And while I'm reading your book, it triggered many thoughts. But now I'm not going to ask the cliche question of what your book is about, as I guess the title speaks for itself. Instead, my first question is, why did you choose this particular topic? What was your main motivation?
I think basically that there was not a whole lot of kind of approachable content written about the IMF or World Bank. They clearly seemed to be very important to our financial system and had a very storied history going back to Bretton Woods. I think a lot of people in the Bitcoin community are familiar with the IMF. A lot of people on the left are familiar with the IMF. They know that basically the IMF is harmful for poor countries, and that's sort of well known, I think. It seems that the role of the World Bank was slightly less understood, basically funding some projects in poor countries. But I think the general literacy of people like me who were just fringe observers was pretty low on what they are, why were they created, what do they do, what are they supposed to do, what is their actual outcome. There's no kind of Big Short type book about them. There's no pop culture book about them that I found significantly rigorous enough. I mean, there's obviously Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which is some guy's story. Who knows how true it is? Obviously, it has some truth to it, but also probably a bunch of stuff he made up. So that tends to be people's experience. Learning about it is through a book like that. A lot of people on the left also read a lot of anti-globalization stuff, like the shock doctrine, etc., which is somewhat related, but not really. Really, all the good stuff written about the bank and the fund all came out in the 80s and 90s, even the 70s. So there hasn't been a whole lot of good stuff recently, even though the organizations had grown a lot. And I just felt that I wanted to learn more. So I just started reading as much as I could about the bank and the fund. And I decided to start writing a very long essay that would become a book. Yeah.
You have a pretty unexpected statement at the beginning of the book saying, I was not prepared for what I unearthed. Yeah. And I must admit, I was not prepared either to read your book. But why are you saying this?
Well, because again, I think that we are prepared to know that they're harmful for poor countries. I think that that's well known and maybe wouldn't shock us that they squeeze poor countries or support dictators or bail out bad governments or are just wasteful, inefficient. I mean, all of these things would not probably surprise people. The thing that really shocked me was that they were not just harmful, but exploitative, self-serving. I didn't realize that they were tools for helping us. I just thought they were, I didn't really know. I mean, I thought they were harmful and corrupt. I didn't realize that they were tools for colonial drain of resources for us to enrich our societies. That totally blew my mind.
When you go deeper and deeper, the truth comes out.
Yeah.
Why do you say that the concept of the IMF and the World Bank is the biggest Ponzi scheme on earth? This is another very harsh statement of yours.
Well, I think that foreign lending is really large, and that the international bond market also, which is increasingly kind of how a lot of these countries have funded themselves, whereby maybe a rich country, instead of giving a straightforward loan to a poor country, maybe it basically buys a bond that they issue.
Yeah.
But in any event, the area of like sovereign debt is really big. Like it's many trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
It's a really, really large bubble. And I think in the 70s, it was pretty clear that people knew that like developing world debt, which again is in the trillions of dollars, could never be paid back. It was not designed to be paid back. I mean, there's no way that these countries could pay back the debt. The only way they could pay back the debt was with more debt. That's the definition of a Ponzi scheme. So that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, I agree with you. So jumping to another topic, your work often focuses on the intersection of human rights and emerging technologies like Bitcoin. How do you see Bitcoin contributing to the fight for human rights and individual freedoms? What to do with Bitcoin and human rights at all?
Well, to relate to the book and the work on the IMF and World Bank, if you were being structurally adjusted in a country in the 1980s or 70s, and maybe that was a communist country like Romania, maybe that was a Latin American country like Peru, maybe that was an African country like Tanzania, maybe it was an Asian country like Indonesia. There's just, again, like most countries have been structurally adjusted. So there was very little you as a poor or lower middle class person could really do to escape, and that's obviously the majority of the population in all countries. The tools that you have to earn wages and save are usually your local fiat currency. I mean, it's not like, especially in the 80s, there was no digital access to anything. So
of course,
you had the paper money, probably didn't have a bank account. Gold was probably not attainable, and maybe you had cattle or something like that. But generally speaking, your monetary technology was your local currency if you weren't in the top 10% or 5% or even 1% of these countries. And there was really no way to escape the structural adjustment, which squeezes the currency and devalues it and shrinks the local economy. That is a tragedy, and it resulted in the deaths of probably tens of millions of people. I mean, it's not entirely clear, but that's probably a pretty educated estimate. Today, people can escape with Bitcoin. They can escape. They can take their time and energy, and instead of converting it and storing it in a collapsing Egyptian pound or something like that, they can convert it to Bitcoin, and they can control it themselves. They can send it anywhere in the world. They can set up an arrangement where their family helps them control it. They can split the seed phrase. They can have multi-sig. They can do all kinds of things to secure their wealth and custody it themselves and trade it internationally and just sort of escape from the system. And I think that that's incredibly powerful.
Do you agree with the statement that free speech equals Bitcoin? Like free speech is code and code is Bitcoin?
I mean, I think that might be a little general. I think that Bitcoin is a form of free speech, and I think that Bitcoin protects free speech. It is not really possible to censor Bitcoin. Like it's built in a way where that's very impractical and unlikely, because there's always someone who's going to be willing to process your transaction and carry your message. It is a global decentralized network of speech posters, we could say.
Uh-huh.
If this one country or this jurisdiction doesn't want you to say something, what are you going to do? Like, they can't stop you from sending a Bitcoin transaction to someone else, and you can put your speech, you know, in the upper
Into
turn.
the message, basically.
Yeah, you can put it in the upper turn, but also like it can pay for a message. It could zap somebody on Nostr. I mean, there's a lot of different ways. I mean, it could carry value to a podcaster. I mean, there's a lot of ways that Bitcoin can sustain free speech. It can be a donation to a journalist outfit that the government is trying to take down.
Yeah.
Having uncensorable money is a really important ally to uncensorable speech.
In your view, what are some common misconceptions or misunderstandings people have about Bitcoin and its potential for promoting financial freedom and human rights?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a process. Like, this is a slow process. Like, it's not going to be as fast, I don't think, even as maybe the internet. Like, we'll see. But like, it takes a long time for these things to happen. And there's a lot of sort of bullshit along the way. Like, it's just a big, big, big deal. We're not talking about just like expediting information. We're talking about changing the way people think about money and value and finance and structures of savings and lending. Like, it's the most sort of basic human networking technology is money. At kind of at its core. Not everybody wants to deal with agriculture or human rights or art, but everybody has to deal with money. So it's something that's going to eventually touch everybody and on the planet, billions of people. So I think it's just going to take time. I don't think it's going to happen immediately. I think there are events that could be big step functions in terms of adoption and things like that, but this is just going to be this really, really kind of slow, ongoing process. So I think that people get the conception that like, oh, Bitcoin's too slow, like it's not working, like it's frustrating. Why isn't it working? I mean, it's going to go at its pace. Like, I think that pace is probably going to quicken, but in general, it's hard for people to learn how to use a new monetary technology and trust it. And that previously has taken many, many decades, if not hundreds or even thousands of years to shift organically in human history. And now we're asking people to do it in like a day or a week or a month. And that's really probably not going to happen. Like, I think the technology component of Bitcoin is one thing, but the social component is it's really the big thing. It's not really about the technology. It's about the social outcome and impact of Bitcoin. And that's a very slow process. I mean, it's similar to like democratization of a society. Like, it's not smooth. Like, you have a country that's been in a communist regime for decades, and then it starts to open up. Okay, well, what does that actually look like? Well, it takes a lot of time for those liberties to congeal, for people to remember how to use them, for new journalists to start working and remember that they don't have to be afraid. Like, this takes time, and sometimes it doesn't work. It gets derailed. I would say there's obviously big challenges in Hungary today on this front, in a lot of ways. It's not a straight path. I mean, a lot in the human rights space, a lot of people say the easy part is the revolution, the hard part's what comes after, right?
Exactly.
How do you build an open society that's free, that actually gives everybody rights, is really hard, because you have people with different nationalism, and some people don't like immigrants, and some people don't like Jews, and some people don't like gays, and these things are poisonous things that exist and that have to be dealt with, and it takes time for people to mature. Like, even in my own country, we've had poisonous things like the war on drugs, and people who don't believe that gay people should have the same rights as others, like, and these things, or that blacks should not marry whites. Like, these are ideas that are popular, or that women should not have the right to vote, or whatever. Like, these are like things that people believed for a long time that were wrong, but that take decades to unlearn or to change. The good news is, like, we can be optimistic because they do change. Like women have the right to vote. Blacks can marry whites. Like you don't go to jail for having a small amount of marijuana anymore. Like the gays can marry. Like these have changed, but it takes time, and there's a lot of conflict. So I think there's going to be a lot of conflict with Bitcoin adoption is going to be tremendously challenging for most people. So I think that's kind of what I would say about that.
You write in your book, and let me quote it. In the past 2 years, the World Bank and the IMF have pumped hundreds of billions of dollars into countries following government lockdowns and COVID-19 pandemic restrictions. More loans were given out in a shorter time than ever before. And you also write that even where the World Bank and the IMF's influence shrink, the Chinese Communist Party is beginning to step in. In the past decade, China has tried to emulate the dynamics of the IMF and the World Bank through its own development institutions and through its Belt and Road Initiative. So we have another issue here. And at this point, let me share my personal involvement in this. Mm-hmm. As you also mentioned Hungary, so this Prime Minister of Hungary visits a place called Tusványos, which is in Transylvania, every year. It happened the last week. And I must add that the location itself is an insult, if you are familiar with the Hungarian history, to share his views on the world and set Hungary's direction for the future. And I don't wish to dwell on what he said. Sure. What struck me the most was the response of some Hungarian retirees present there when asked by interviewers. And they expressed that they feel much closer in terms of mentality to China than to the West. From the West, what flows to Hungary is, in their view, is pornography and LGBTQ, while the Chinese are seen much better, I could say much cooler, probably because this beloved Hungarian leader says so. And by the way, according to an article published 15 years ago in The Guardian in 2008, Hungary was the first country in the European Union's history as a member state who has been rescued by the IMF. So back to my question. Now it seems to me that until now we only had the IMF and the World Bank. However, slowly but surely, there is a new competing institute from China. Is this statement correct?
Yes, I think all empires will try to copy the US and what they've done to control trade, to rig the trade rules, to favor their country's securing of energy and food, and in rare, scarce resources. They will try to use debt colonialism. The US and Europe really pioneered this along with Japan, and that's what the book is about. And that they are the ones who've done this post 1960s. They figured out how to replace the sword with the checkbook, you know. But China was watching, and they're doing it, and they did it in a huge way. It's like in some cases it's on par with, or even past or surpassing the volume of foreign lending from the US, Japan, EU kind of nexus. That said, it's not as robust because they don't issue the world reserve currency like the US does. And it's just a little harder for them, and they're having a lot of problems. And I think their lending is now shrinking. I think Putin tried to do some of the same stuff through the Shanghai, Cooperation Council or whatever. And he's obviously got some loans out to former Soviet states that are similar. They come with similar conditions. I think it's natural that any big power is going to try and do this to smaller powers in its region over time.
It's like human nature, no?
Yeah, I think we can expect them to do this. I don't know if they'll be as successful, but it's certainly like a more clever way of getting the resources you need. Now, of course, if Putin has to, he'll, like Putin's not able to exploit Ukraine in the same way that maybe the West can in terms of farmland and things like that.
Yeah.
So he's just like, screw it, I'm going to invade them. So that's, and same thing with the US. Like the US was not quite able to like exploit Iraq the way it wanted to. in terms of making it comply with the dollar system, etc. So we invaded it. So I think that, invasion is more of a last option. I mean, these regimes are going to these empires are going to try to use debt colonialism first to subjugate and exploit small countries. When that doesn't work, they'll try military force.
In your opinion, what are some of the most pressing human rights issues in the digital age? And how do you believe they can be addressed?
I think it has to do with surveillance and control. And European policymakers in particular are showing through their words and actions that they are not interested in protecting freedom. They pretend to care about the public and stress values like security and stability. And they explain that they can't allow freedom or liberty type values to interfere with that. They basically say that, individuals can only have liberty to a particular extent, that they'll mostly protect freedom and privacy. And I just don't think that's acceptable. And this is a
You mean the mostly part? So it has to be like fully protected?
Well, they basically say you'll have privacy, with minor exceptions is what they say.
Yeah.
And that's just not acceptable. I mean, that's the same idea as you can have freedom of speech, but not freedom after speech. It's just kind of hypocrisy. Freedom for them and not for us. So this is the same kind of government speak that we've had for decades. And what wins is software, like in the digital age. Like what wins is people creating open source software that can protect us. What wins is people like Phil Zimmerman in the United States in the early 1990s creating a technology that allowed two computer users to trade private messages. This was illegal at the time. It actually violated some old military laws that the United States had around encryption. But you know what? Software was released into the world. You couldn't put it back into the bottle. The government tried to fight it, but eventually had to evolve. And now encryption is like layered into our lives in e-commerce, in Signal, in messaging, in WhatsApp, etc. So that was done because somebody asked for forgiveness, not permission. So today, when we're building the payment networks and social networks and data storage networks that we want, we just need to support open source software, open source code, decentralized open source money, and let's build, and then the society will have to react and evolve. That's, I think, the way forward.
But do you think that we can still opt out of the system? And if so, until when?
Of course. I mean, you can opt out of the system today by using Signal on your phone instead of a text message. I mean, this prevents the government from knowing what you say. Maybe they know who you're speaking to and they know when you sent the message, but they can't read what's inside unless they've compromised your phone. So it basically forces the government to be even more illegal. Like it forces them to like spy on your actual physical phone, right? You can also opt out with Bitcoin. I mean, you can opt out of the fiat currency system with Bitcoin. So there's definitely different ways to opt out. And this is true for anyone anywhere in the world.
So can Bitcoin change the core dynamics of the world's power and resources structure?
Well, I think that remains unseen. We don't know. But what we do know is that it allows individuals anywhere to opt out of a debt trap that has been created due to power dynamics in the world. We have rich countries that seek resources and minerals and cheap labor for their economies. And one way they do that is they go into poor countries and they repress the currency. They devalue the currency. They shrink the value of the local currency. And this allows them to get stuff cheap. If every country is on the same currency, you can't do that anymore. You can't do
Exactly.
currency devaluation. It's just Bitcoin. Everybody's denominating in Bitcoin and people use Bitcoin and that's it. That is a hope. And I do think that does actually radically shift quite a few things. It makes things, I think, more fair. Now, it doesn't make things equal. I mean, you're still going to have very poor countries and very rich countries. You're still going to have empires. But the way you would achieve that is very different than today. The way that a country is going to be successful is just going to be different from today. Today, former colonial powers that are smaller than the territories that they are exploiting are able to use debt as this weapon. And they're able to use currency devaluation as this weapon because the fiat currency system can be weaponized. It is much, much harder to weaponize Bitcoin because it's equal for everyone.
Which blend of social, economical, and political factors is essential for Bitcoin to be more broadly recognized and used as a currency? What would be the prerequisites? What do you think?
Just the current trajectory of governments. I mean, if they continue to devalue currencies and they continue to deplatform people, people will continue to opt into Bitcoin and learn about it. Many people get into Bitcoin because they have to. A lot of people get into it because of speculative reasons, but a lot of people get into it because they have no other choice. It just makes the most sense for them. It's the only way to send money from A to B. It's the only way to preserve wealth from A to B, etc., etc.
We can see that adoption is evident in developing countries, struggling with enormous debts, thanks in part to the beneficial involvement of the IMF and the World Bank. However, we also see that in the current economic situation that has emerged after COVID, developed countries, such as those in Europe, have also fallen into the trap of debt. Can this be an advantage in terms of adoption? What is your view on this?
I think that the motivations are an interesting factor. I think that governments are initially going to oppose Bitcoin. That's their reactive first instinct. The first phase, the early phase, of course, is they do nothing because they ignore it, right? We're kind of we're kind of past that phase, or we're nearing the end of that phase. The first real action is to react strongly and to try and put this thing back in the bottle. To try and limit the ability of people to use it. So in China, in India, in the United States, Nigeria, EU, governments have tried different ways to do this. They can try limiting the ability of people to opt out through taxation, through different kinds of capital control laws. They can be super aggressive like China or Nigeria and just ban the ability of you to convert Bitcoin to fiat in the banking system. So that's, you can't do that in those countries. It forces people into P2P markets. It doesn't stop Bitcoin adoption, but that's an initial reaction. And I think that fight is the initial sort of reaction. I think eventually what starts to happen is some countries realize there's opportunity. And like El Salvador, they're going to start to realize that this could actually help people, but also it can help them in whatever way, in various ways. So I think it's a little bit of a 3-stage process. First, they ignore you, then they fight you. Maybe there's the laugh phase, maybe they do laugh at you a little bit, but there's a little bit of that now. There's a lot of arrogance towards Bitcoin. So maybe there's ignorance, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win, right? So I think it really follows that pretty well.
Yeah. Undoubtedly, we are in a transition, I hope, I assume.
Yeah.
Some people claim that with AI, for instance, humanity, and also I claim Bitcoin in this example, that we have the tool for turning everything for the better. Do you think that this could ever happen? What do you think, for example, about universal basic income?
Well, I think that Bitcoin forces more discipline on governments. They have to be less wasteful. It's harder to create new monetary units when you're bound by a Bitcoin standard. It's different from a gold standard in which gold can be centralized and then like claims on gold can be manipulated. It's a little harder to do that with Bitcoin. In fact, this is one of the reasons Bitcoin was created, was that if individuals could actually hold the underlying and verify the total amount that exists, and anyone can like relatively easily get the underlying, it's much harder to have these like paper markets because you can just have the real thing, right? So, I mean, you kind of see that with GBTC now, and you're gonna see different like funds which give people the ability to, you know, get Bitcoin price exposure. But if those funds aren't essentially like 100% backed, you'll see runs on them. They'll collapse. I mean, this is exactly what's happening with GBTC right now, basically. Like, you know, it's highly unlikely that they had a full backing, and they're going down, or they're in the process of disintegrating or something. So, I think that that's the case. Whereas with gold, you can do permanent repression essentially, because it's not a digital asset, it's physical. And, you know, most people who own gold, quote unquote, just own a claim. That won't be the case with Bitcoin. So I do think that it's going to have potentially a different outcome there.
Mm-hmm. There is no doubt that we live in revolutionary times. I know it's a cliche, but are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future in this current situation?
I mean, I think I have to be optimistic because people haven't had these opportunities before. People have been squeezed, people have been repressed, and they've had no way out. And today they have a way out. And I think that's extremely optimistic. It's also the process through which Bitcoin is created is very optimistic. It's a global scientific collaboration open to everybody around the world. It could be anonymous, pseudonymous contributors making a big impact. That's certainly been true in the Bitcoin ecosystem. It can be people from any country. It is something that is driven more on merit than on nationality or something like that. Which is completely different from the world today.
Yeah,
very inspiring.
Okay. Lastly, who would you recommend your book to?
Yeah, who would I recommend my book to? Look, I think it's really written for Europeans and Americans, basically, maybe Japanese. And it's written for creditor nation populations. It's written for people who live in societies that have benefited from the IMF and World Bank, that have benefited from economic colonialism. It's to help them wake up and understand what has happened, and then they can come to terms with it. You know, they can make their own reflections. But you need to know that your society is great, not just because of its values, but also because it exploited other countries. You know, that's important. I think that's important to understand.
And just out of my curiosity, did you hear back from them? Did they have any comment?
Some of them have tried to engage in arguments, but not at the high level. No. I mean, I continue to push with the book, and we'll see. But ultimately, this is not a topic that's going to be on, you know, evening news, because no one wants to hear it.
Of course not. Of course not. No, I was just curious.
But I have been successful in getting some of the topics and themes into the wider narrative. I mean, I think, you know, I did a bunch of work on part of this, which is the colonial franc system in Africa. And I think that, you know, my work there has been pretty significant in terms of educating people about this topic and you know, creating a little bit of maybe even a resistance in some ways. So it might not be, you know, measurable across the whole IMF World Bank thing, but I do think that, I think that it will make a difference. I mean, we're taking a small but very capable group of people the global Bitcoin community, they certainly are now, a lot of them have read this book. A lot of them have read the things that are the arguments in this book. And I think that's really important because they're the ones who are going to help fashion and lead this new economy,
Yeah. As I told you,
start with educating the vanguard,
Yeah, exactly. No, as I told you, I still have the hope and will to translate the book into Hungarian to spread the word.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Hopefully, this will happen in the near future. Anyway, thank you, Alex, so much for taking the time to do this interview, and I really highly recommend the book. I really enjoyed it, and it's really very fascinating and interesting. So thank you so much, and all the best.
Thank you so much.
Ez volt a Bitcoin Kebab, a Bitcoin bázis podcastja.